Welcome to the Doctrine of Salvation, Module 5, explaining sacred space, sacrifice, and atonement. Last time we talked about the words faith, righteousness, idolatry. My point being, let's get those words nailed down as to what they mean in the Bible so that the story can use them in a way that now we can use them today and make sense of what God wants us to know about the doctrine of salvation. Before we get to Jesus, and we're getting there soon, there's going to be three actually, more modules to just bridge that gap between the Old and New Testaments, getting some vital information involved there. And this time is the conversation of these words that are different to us in our modern world. You've never seen a sacrifice, probably, and I'm glad I never have. You have never seen a ritual atonement, those kind of things. So I want to talk about that because Jesus' atonement will be a conversation that we'll have about the doctrine of salvation in the New Testament. But before we get to Jesus' atonement, of course, we need to set our stage in the Old. So that's what we're doing this time. This is a tough topic also because you are tempted to backload information into the Old Testament that you presume is happening in the New. And we'll talk about that here and in coming modules. Proposition number one. The Bible was written within a culture that assumed sacred protocols such as, and you could list a dozen things here, but temples, priests, and sacrifices and such are part of the world that Moses was in. He got it from Egypt and so forth. And so when we have, look at that last sentence. Do you buy this? Neither God nor Moses invented temples, priests, sacrifices. Those are things that are part of the story. It's the scenery, it's the backdrop before the play even begins. We're tempted again to say, well, God started it. Well, I'd say, show me the text. There is no text. You have Cain and Abel sacrificing, remember that, but it doesn't say how or why. And so we would be very careful, I'd say even amiss, if we try to put theology in that early. All we can say is they did it, but we don't know why. Or we need to wait if we can figure out the why. So my point is that when we come upon a tabernacle with all the dimensions and the paraphernalia explained in the books of Leviticus and Exodus and such, let's not get ahead of ourselves and say, oh, God wanted this. Because again, God's going to give them divorce law. He's going to give them slavery laws. He's going to talk about polygamy, how to handle two wives and so forth. And Jesus even admitted in Matthew that when you have divorce law, it's not because God wanted it, it's because God allowed it, or in that case, the hardness of their heart. So there's going to be some laws and some discussions, I'd say this would be one of them, where God picked up the pieces of a nation heading out of Egypt and said, here's what I want you to do now, based upon what you know before. Again, these sacrificial altars that are found in Israel, this is a model, or this has been moved to a museum, but this accords to the kind of sacrificial altars that we have around the world. Let me read this to you. This is just from a recent Biblical Archaeology Review article, but pertinent to our study. Practically every culture distinguishes between clean and unclean things, actions, and people. This is true for simple hygiene as well as for ritual or religious purity. Throughout history, various societies have developed different ways of separating the pure and the impure, usually by imposing restrictions on the movement and behavior of the impure. Remember, the leper had to say, leper, leper, and stand aside. Given the universality of the idea of impurity, it is not surprising that the Hebrew Bible, now come into the stage, the Bible, people, that's full of references to purity and impurity. The widespread attestation of taboo throughout the Bible, along with its near universality and prevalence in the ancient Near East, suggest it was indeed common in ancient Israel. The relevant texts throughout the Bible do not attempt to invent it. They simply reflect it. And so what I'm saying here, in other words, is just standard understanding within the academic world. Well, proposition number two, building on that. While in Egypt, think specifically now of the story of Israel. While in Egypt, the Hebrews didn't have a religion. They didn't develop one before this. They were a family, right? And they get enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. They learned Egyptian religion. Now, they probably had some Yahwist loyalists in the family, like a Joseph and others, but when it came to religious practices, you can guess where they looked. The rituals described in Mosaic law were thus received as familiar concepts, though designed in their case, in Israel's case, for a specific place and time, Canaan in 15th century BC. The law, in other words, as it came to the people, they didn't say, "What's this?" They would have seen laws of other nations, including the Code of Hammurabi. This is a Babylonian law code. Hammurabi was a king in Babylon. And kings always thought of themselves as patrons of the gods. And so if you worshipped Marduk, you would take Marduk's laws and put them out on a stele or a stone in front of your city, and you would tell people how to act based on your god's wishes. And that would be, like in this case, it wasn't on that kind of a stone, but the Code of Hammurabi is a pretty lengthy law code that predates Moses. And that's the important thing. This comes before Moses and the Ten Commandments. Do you notice some of the lines that sound familiar? If you blind one person, they'll blind you. If you knock out a tooth, you're going to get your tooth knocked out. My point is that when Moses got his laws or gave the people his laws, guess what? Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. You're getting the same language. Now, there are differences, clearly. When I was in PhD work, you had to choose your paper that you were going to write every class and had to work it with the professor and that kind of stuff. And I remember one time I said, I want to compare the 7 ancient law codes that predate Moses to Torah and just see how. And I remember the smile, the wry smile he had on his face, like, you're going to learn something new here, or you're going to be surprised at what you find. That's really what he meant by that smile. He told me when I asked him why he smiled, because the similarities are eerie, but the differences are instructive. And that's what you can do with these law codes. The point is, Moses didn't invent a lot of this stuff. This has already predated him. This gets it now to sacrifice. Let's talk about that. In my estimation, over the years, the ritual, well, let me read it, number 3. The ancient ritual of sacrifice remains one of the most misunderstood concepts in all of religion. Here's my theory. See if you buy it. This is because we tend to place perceived meaning backwards into the ancient practice. If you lean over at church next Sunday and say to your friend, what did sacrifice mean in the ancient world? I don't think they're going to think about the ancient Near Eastern dictionary they've been reading lately. They're not going to go back to the Akkadians and the Sumerians. They're thinking in terms of what they've heard in their hymnology and, the way we think of Jesus' sacrifice. And so you'll see something, this is just it's not a real receipt, but you can see the point that if we, this was a Facebook post, and the point being that if Jesus paid it all, we are appreciative of that and we work with that. But the idea of him paying, that's the point, that if we have that in our mind and then we say to our friend, what is sacrifice? And they bring up payment, where'd they get that from? They got it from Jesus and they moved it back into the Old Testament. Now, in a schematic, see if you can follow my argument here. Here's why we think that Jesus' cross, a sacrifice, paid for sin or covered wrath. The reason we think that's true is because, well, back here, you've heard this. This is what I was taught. I'm curious if you heard it. That paid because this temporarily paid. These sacrifices that they were doing was temporarily averting God's wrath and taking care of temporarily the issue of their sinfulness. That's why you sacrifice. Well, then goes the argument that allows Jesus to fully and finally pay, right? Now, do you see what we just did? The only way we got there is because we started there. We started thinking, based on the hymn and on the receipt on Facebook, that Jesus paid. Well, that makes this temporary, and that makes that final. I'd recommend it's very circular. Nobody asked the question in that story, what did this actually mean back here, which is our point in the next several minutes, okay? In fact, let me give you my recommended, very carefully worded answer to what does sacrifice do. Why did Israelites sacrifice? We recall numerous examples of the many patriarchs and leaders, remember Abraham did it and so forth, who built altars seemingly all the time. These individuals were simply following cultural norm, whether living before or after Moses. Archaeological evidence tells of Canaanite altars well back in the 13th and 14th centuries BC, and we suspect this tells the story of all nations long before this time. All ancient cultures viewed the physical world as created and lorded over by deities, and everyone lived and worked under the assumptions that the gods expected some sort of penitential rituals on the part of humans. I saw this, it wasn't 3 years ago, a picture is a missionary in Brazil showing pictures of their work, and on the beach there was a pile of fruit, and someone asked, what's the fruit doing on the beach just by itself? And he said, oh, that's just some food left for the gods that this family worships. Everyone knows not to touch, even if you're starving, you would not touch that fruit because you know that's given by this family to this god on a beach in Brazil. There was even the shared notion, nation to nation, that the gods fed on human blood and food. Most of the categories of sacrifice found in Leviticus 1 to 5, in fact, we have them outside of Israel. I won't read them all to you. But last point, so why sacrifice? Why did they do it? Culture. That's just what you did. Why when you drive into a town you see churches with spires, tall, pointy things? Because that's just what we did. I don't know why we did it. Why do we stand behind lecterns to preach? Because people do it. In other words, there's a lot of things we do that are not given to us by God. It's just part of culture. Nothing wrong with it. It's just how culture worked. And now, of course, we say, and this is again a question I get that I want to give a good, careful answer back. Why? But didn't God tell us to sacrifice? Actually, he didn't. If you think of it this way, and that's what's going to lead off this quotation from a Jewish scholar. The first word in Leviticus is not, do something. It's when you do something. And so the first idea to catch when it comes to sacrificial law in the Old Testament, it's the leading word is when you do it, here's what you do. God presumed they would be doing it. This is a quotation from a teacher at Vanderbilt. He's a Jewish scholar, and it's one of the teaching company's DVDs you can watch. I've really enjoyed it. And he was asking in front of the camera for the audience, why do Jews sacrifice, and why did God give us these laws about sacrifice? See if you enjoy his answer as much. It makes perfect sense to me. Sacrifice was a commandment in Torah, but it was also a concession to human psychology. Here's how it works. Maimonides, he's a medieval Jew, said that a sudden transition from one opposite to another is impossible. What he meant was that people can't go from understanding everything about the world in one way to understanding everything about the world in a completely different way. They need time to adjust. He said this in context of the Israelites being freed from slavery in Egypt when they were steeped in idolatrous practices. Those practices included animal sacrifices. So Maimonides believed that God allowed the Israelites to continue in this practice of sacrificing animals, but to the right address. In other words, the only thing that changed was the address, so that the way the Israelites could still feel that what they were doing was efficacious. They were still involved in this process. What they were doing was still worshiping God, even though that's not the most noble, most authentic way of worshiping. God doesn't need it, but he allowed it as long as you did it to the right address. That's Chaim Cherry's understanding through Maimonides, a Jewish scholar, of why God gave us all these laws. And here's the point to come. We lost all that in 586 BC when the nation went into exile. So why do we have it for those 900 years is going to be the question that Jews had, and that's their answer today. Proposition number 4. Ancient society believed that human interaction with gods was a precarious, often dangerous affair. Cleansing, both physical and ritual, was expected when approaching a deity's home, space, pots and pans, priests, anything a deity touched or had association with, you considered that what we're going to call sacred space. It's not a biblical term, it's a theological term, but I think you can catch the idea. These diagrams of biblical temples. This is Solomon's. It's not told us in the Bible explicitly the dimensions and such, but we have this idea of a porch. Think of a home where you come into the or the porch. You take off your shoes, wash your feet anyway, and you move into the house. The farther you get into the house, the cleaner you get. It's presumed. In the sense, the same way with God, the idea was you would clean yourself somewhere near the porch. This would be the area for priests. The God lived inside the back room, or what's called the Holy of Holy place, Holy of Holies. This is from a Syrian. Syria has an ancient temple that they unearthed, and so this is not even in the Bible. This is an archaeological site outside of Israel. Notice they have the same concept that you'd walk in here. There's footprints in stone actually there, and the farther in you go, the more holy it was considered because the God lived in the back room. That's exactly how Israel saw their temple. The Holy of Holies was the actual throne room of Yahweh in ancient thinking. So that's where the deity would live or presume to live. That's not far from the idea of Herod's temple. This is a model in Jerusalem. Herod's temple had, notice on that far right side, let's pull it in there, that is a wall that's built around the temple. What is that wall? Flavius Josephus, a Jewish scholar writing for Rome in Jesus' day, told us what that wall was for. When you go through these first cloisters into the second court of the temple, there was a partition made of stone all around, whose height was 3 cubits. Its construction was very elegant. Upon it stood pillars of equal distances from one another, declaring the law of purity, some in Greek, some in Roman letters. So here's the point, that no foreigner would go within the sanctuary. They were very careful about letting non-Jews or unclean Jews, either one's a problem, past that wall. In fact, we have found this is a redoing or a copy or a model of this sign that must have been along this wall at different spaces, where it tells the outsider, if you go past this wall, you have your own death to deal with, and we're not going to shed a tear about it. The common reaction I get during this kind of a lecture is, so what? This is just what people thought about, quote, sacred space. But remember how important it was. Acts 21. Men of Israel, help. This, Paul, is a man who teaches all men everywhere against the people the law in this place. And furthermore, he has brought Greeks into the temple and has defied this holy place. And the people seized Paul, dragged him out, and they were trying to kill him over bringing someone from point A to point B past a wall. What are they? We have to think like them. My deity lives there. You're a Greek, you're a Roman, you're not a Yahwist, or you're a leper, you're blind. You can't go in. You're unclean. You need to clean up first. That's how they thought, and it was so severe that we have right there in the middle of our narrative in Acts, one of the times that Paul was being killed over that. So is it important? Absolutely. And so what I'm going to be arguing for, some have said, well, it can't be big enough. And I'd say, I think we have to think like them to know how big it was. Number 5, let's talk about sin. Here's another English word that I think we often use it in a way that confuses the issue biblically. Sin is a thoroughly English word with no clear Hebrew or Greek equivalent. In Hebrew, the word often translated as sin is chata. It has broad meaning in Hebrew, from missing a physical target, slinging a stone, and kataing, missing, or committing murder. I mean, it is a huge word of all sorts of meanings based on, again, context. Here is in schematic form where we make our mistake. Sin to us is a moral thing. Missing a mark isn't a sin. That's missing, right? The word in Hebrew, kata, includes that, but it includes so much more. So we have to think in a larger circle there that includes moral offenses such as murder, and amoral would be leprosy, discharges, just being a Gentile. There's all sorts of things that they would list over there on the amoral side that you couldn't help. Touching a carcass, if you're a farmer, is a daily offense, but it's an offense only in the sense of kata. We don't know what to call it because we don't have an English word for it. Okay. Question: which of these two, now think in the kata sense, which of these two could you sacrifice for in the biblical model? I hope you're thinking ahead here. That's the side you would sacrifice. You wouldn't murder someone and grab a dog to go sacrifice it. It just, well, they didn't. That would be blasphemous. You don't do something wrong and then grab an animal. Reminds me of my high school years. I was in a class with my good friend, and he was telling me on a Friday night all the bad stuff he was going to do. And I remember just saying, Tommy, I love Tommy, you can't do that. And he said, I'm going to confession tomorrow or Saturday. And in his mind, he had a very nice arrangement. He would sin 4 times Friday night and do 4 Hail Marys on Saturday morning. That's a nice arrangement if your God's okay with that. That's not how it worked, of course, back there. So the sacrifice was for that stuff. There is no sacrifice for what's called high-handed sin. In fact, let me show you a text. This is an interesting one in Numbers. So the priest shall make atonement for the, and we'll talk about atonement momentarily, for the person who sins unintentionally, as this translation calls it. And by that, we don't mean, oops, I spilled the milk. It's, I did it because I was bored, passionate, lustful. You know, and there's a lot of things you do that where you're not holding your hand to God saying, I hate you, I'm going to go do this. You do it because you have the opportunity and you do it. That's what this word meant. To make atonement for him, it shall be forgiven him, released. Again, that word in English has interesting meaning. You shall have one law for him who sins unintentionally, for him who is native born among the children of Israel. Okay, so there's going to be people who do something that get to sacrifice, but next word. The person who does anything, and the word in Hebrew is literally holding your fist up to God, like that. Whether he is a native born or a stranger, that one brings approach on the Lord. He shall be cut off from the people because he has despised the word of the Lord. You don't let that guy live. Here's the thing. David, when he committed sin with Bathsheba, which one is that unintentional or high-handed? We're tempted to say, you don't just do that. I understand that, but I don't see David asking for Bathsheba with a hand to God, with a fist. I see David doing something wrong, stupid, hurtful, but not this. That's why when the story's over, David doesn't sacrifice for the Bathsheba story. You know what he does? He gets on his knees and apologizes and just says, God, I'm so sorry. Just, read 2 Samuel 12. He doesn't sacrifice for that because he knows that would be an abomination to do that when you've done something. I'm sorry, when something that like a murder can't be here. But when it comes to unintentional or not high-handed, there's going to be examples of that. Actually, the 2 Samuel one, don't even read that part because he doesn't get into that, but we'll talk about David later. Here's where we got to get into then New Testament. I know I'm getting ahead, but here's where we make this idea that we have a New Testament idea. Let's import it back into the Old. Here's that verse that catches us. Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. Well, as soon as you say the word sin, you have to ask, what sins are we talking about? Because that's English. You can't go from the sin there to the sin here and then say, oh, well, that's moral offense. That's because that word does not exist in the Bible. This word exists in the Bible. It would be hamartia in Greek, but it's the same idea. What sins did Jesus die for? Those. And if you say, well, that's not big enough, you don't understand their world. You don't understand how Paul was about to be killed for bringing someone from point A 3 feet later to point B. They were so severely wondering, how do we get clean? How can we be clean in front of our deity for the sake of worship? That's what this is all about. And that's why, again, English doesn't often work for us. Number 6, approaching a deity involved entering what we've called sacred space. How to conduct yourself in that sacred space is always the call of the deity. In other words, this is very presumed or presumptuous in the sense that we have to watch the stories. Crossing over that barricade is going into what they would have called sacred space. But notice how often the stories, on one of them, we're taking off our shoes, as though, what does that have to do to help the problem? In other words, if you say, well, you can't be in the presence of a deity, yeah, you can. You just take off your shoes. No, I would say this deity in this case said, to honor me now and what I want now, take off your sandal. But again, it doesn't make it any more holy. It's just what that deity wanted. Whereas in this one, Gideon is nervous he's going to die because he's been with the deity, with a divine being, an angel. And then Yahweh says, well, you're not going to die. So Yahweh always gets the call when it comes to how to handle sacred space. David said to his servants, is the child dead? Remember when the child born to Bathsheba died. They said he's dead. Here's the point I wanted to make before. So David arose from the ground, washed, and anointed himself. Now, he's already sinned, already been called out on it. So I would say that repentance has already happened, right? He's already repented. He didn't bring a sacrifice to get rid of the murder part or the adultery. Why does he get sacrifice going, or why does he get ritually cleaned? Not for this. He gets cleaned so that he can do that. It's that two-step. I am loyal to Yahweh, and I blew it, so I'm going to apologize, repent. Now I want to go talk to him. I got to get clean. So it's 2 steps, and we're going to see that coming up. Same thing here, sacred space with Isaiah's vision. What does he need? He needs to have his mouth touched, ouch, with a live coal. When's the last time you did that? And that's how he got clean. It just shows again how different this sacred space concept is throughout the Old Testament. Number 7. Let's get to the big word, atonement. Our one process, only one of many, one process of achieving ritual purity in the Old Testament was through kafar, a Hebrew word, often translated as atonement. It means to cover officially. This process was a privilege reserved for the Israelite Yahweh loyalist. All 3 words are important. You had to be a Jew to be atoned in the story of Leviticus. You had to be a Jew or a proselyte. You had to be a Yahweh loyalist. You couldn't be a Moabite. No Moabite gets this. You got to start here. Okay? That's very important to the story of how atonement works. Again, so going back to our Isaiah story, remember we had the word atoned here. Question, what was atoned? Don't say sin. He didn't have sin in his vocabulary. He had kata. His kata was atoned. The point is he was already righteous. He was already in the courtroom. He's a Yahweh loyalist, but he needs to be ritually cleansed from his kata. I hope you're following that. It's to us hard, to them common sense. You wipe your feet when you go in the house, or to use the Seinfeld line, you wipe your wheels from your wheelchair. It's common sense. What did atonement do? Let's be really careful now. The process of achieving ritual purity in the Old Testament is often noted by the use of kafar. We get it as atonement. Originally meaning to cover, it symbolized how a Yahweh Israelite who was guilty of a permitted impurity, there's your unintentional stuff, okay, permitted, not murder, could cover over or solve his kata. At issue with sacred space, respecting God's presence by approaching him in purity and cleanness. It had nothing, again, I hear the sound of my licensure committee going, what? When I say this, but this is the issue that we have come to in our study of salvation. It had nothing to do with the attainment of personal righteousness nor the forgiveness of moral guilt. Atonement did not solve matters of prohibited uncleanness, nor solve the sin of disloyalty. That's a big one. When you atoned, or even went for atonement, what you were saying was, I'm already righteous. I love Yahweh beyond life itself. but I want to go visit him. David, I want to go apologize for my sin with Bathsheba. I want to be clean to talk to my God. This one caught my licensure committee completely off guard because in their mind, you get atoned to go to heaven. And I said, I remember this moment too. I hate to give the story too much, but it was so real. I opened my Bible and I turned it around and I was pushing it toward nicely to one of the men who was asking me. He pushed it back. I'll never forget this. He pushed it back saying, this isn't the time to talk about that. And I wanted to say, well, tell me a better time because you're asking me what something means in the Bible. And that physical pushback, I'll never forget that moment. What did atonement do? Of the 123 uses of kafar, not one example applies to a person who is considered to be living outside the Abrahamic covenant. Big point, right? Turning this into a positive atonement of any kind, and there were bloody and non-bloody atonements, you could use wheat and flour if you were poor, was considered to be a privilege of the person in covenant. Atonement ritual should better be called, I would call it a celebration. I get to go to my God's house. Wow, what a privilege. Therefore, illustrating the provision of cleansing and covering already offered within covenantal grace. At no time was the mechanics of atonement used for entrance into the community. That's why you cannot tell a non-believer, ask Jesus to forgive your sins. He's paid for the price. You can't do that because that would blow the whole story of how atonement works in our Bible. As could be expected, kafar was never made available for those outside the covenant. If you're a Gentile, you're outside the whole story that we've talked about. Everything we've said to this point doesn't count for you. I'm Swedish, Norwegian. I can't do it. I got to be a Jew to do it, according to the Bible. Again, that's what we're arguing for here, is the biblical usage of the term. Number 8. Israel therefore considered personal salvation, I said this, to be a two-step process. We are not ready for this one, so again, hold on to your hat. When we say salvation, we think praying a prayer. They thought in which one's faith loyalty to Yahweh was accompanied by occasional, depending on my day, if I wanted to go to the tabernacle or not, kind of a thing, approach to sacred space. So a very simple picture. I get I get righteous by my faith or faithfulness. That's step 1. If I want to go to where Yahweh lived, that would be the holy place. I would, number 3, but my second step would be to get atoned, cleaned, sacrificed, ritually purified, so that I could make the path symbolically to Yahweh's house. Okay? So 1, 2, causing a third, which in my case is my second step. Hope that makes sense. But notice, let's continue thinking through. Now, let's keep that paradigm in mind as I read this. Why do we say 2? As loyalty to Yahweh was required, that first one, so it was assumed that each loyal Israelite would also function according to tribal laws, the second step. In this sense, salvation as a theological idea is consistently understood as a 2-step process. Faith is accompanied by worship. Faith, worship. Practically pictured as the presentation of the loyalist to Yahweh in devotion. See if you can handle my sentence here. I could be clearer. The former always presumed the latter. The former, faith, always presumed the latter. With understandable exceptions. A good example to me is a Mother's Day card. I love my mother, I give her a card, unless I'm in jail or at the bottom of a ravine having crashed my car, right? While the latter, worship, could not happen without the former and was blasphemous if attempted. If I hate my mother and I told her I hated her and then I give her a batch of flowers and say, there you go, you old battle axe. The point being, sorry, Mom, the idea of giving God worship and hating him would be blasphemous. You see how you can't switch these two around. So, quick point. 1, I always stay loyal to Yahweh. If I'm a farmer and I'm touching carcasses all day, I may not go in to the tabernacle. Therefore, occasional meaning it's driven by the occasion. I don't have to go. So atonement, I'm not going to get atoned. Why would I need to? I'm out in the farm. Okay. There's also exceptions permitted. And this is the beauty of the Old Testament. Again, it's buried, one of my favorite verses, it's buried in Second Chronicles. When's the last time you saw this verse? But it's just fantastic. For a multitude of the people, many from Ephraim, Manasseh, whatever, had not cleansed themselves, yet they ate the Passover, contrary to what was written. He even says they're not doing what the law said. But Hezekiah prayed to them, saying, May the good Lord provide atonement for everyone who prepares his heart to seek God, the Lord God of his father. Wait a second, back up. Ever had a prayer prayed by your pastor and you say, you better replay the tape on that one? That's asking a little bit too much. May the good, I love how he says good there, Lord, provide atonement, there's our ritualistic term, for everyone who, and you're prepared to talk about Levitical law, prepares his heart. What I love about this, God hears this statement and God says, sounds good to me. Sounds good to me. You guys got me figured out. You figured me out. All I want is your heart. If I got your heart, I got everything I need. It's just a beautiful text, again, buried deeply into our Old Testament. Exclamation point. They weren't cleansed according to but their heart was right. And God says, sounds good to me. And they're right in the middle of the law period. Don't say, again, this is a class coming back to haunt me in seminary. When I said this in front of my professor, the point being, this is in the period of law that we're doing this. This isn't after. This is right during that period. And yet God says it's okay with me. The reason David had God's heart and vice versa is he saw this well ahead of time. You know these verses. When were they said in the biblical story? Not at the end when they figured it out, but at the beginning of David's own, he was probably a shepherd boy, and he saw through the beauty of his God's character up front. And nobody, I think, saw it coming as clearly as David did. So, two-step process. 1, you love Yahweh. 2, you want to go in and talk to him. That requires atonement. Here's a quick verse. You got these several places in the Old and New Testaments. The Egyptians will know the Lord in that day. There's your 1. And they'll make sacrifice. 2 steps, 1 to them. The salvation, just this whole thing is how you join the story of what God is telling. But notice you can't do, if the person is worshiping another God, if that's out of the story, well, no, you're not going to go there. So the whole thing falls apart based on the first one, right? The 2-step process. Number 9, quickly, the loss of Israel's sacred space, big point in our story. In 586, they lose the tabernacle. It's quashed. I don't know a better verb there to choose, but the whole sacred space story is gone in 586 based on Babylon destroying the temple. The faithful Israelite now approached, that's a symbolic term, obviously, Yahweh without temple, priests, atonement. Daniel in Babylon didn't have a priest to go to, didn't have a sacrifice to make, and yet he made it. How? Because he understood this concept and did not need it. This is from a book, I just like how he says it. The fact that the Jews were able to replace the sacrificial means of atonement by other means when it was not permissible to present sacrifices is further evidence it was not the sacrificial offerings themselves that were able to obtain divine forgiveness, but the spirit of repentance. This reminds me of a lot of what Dr. Mike would often say. I'm not creating new material for you guys. I'm just connecting dots that are there. And I would say the same with atonement. I'm not, in this discussion, I haven't done anything new to the text. I'm saying, I believe, and showing other people that have said it, look at the text, watch the story unfold, and it should make good sense. So was it not real? This is, again, a good question I've thought of. Is there no such thing as sacred space in the sense that God says, hey, don't worry about it? Well, I'll let you read this on your own. I would say, yeah. In fact, look at the last line. Well, this whole thing. In the end, any necessary link or relationship between personal restorative forgiveness and cultic sacrifice is unintentional. God never intended for people to think, I want to get forgiven. Let me go get a cat, kill it. If they thought that way, God's saying, oh, no. That was never the intention. Following the trajectory set out by the story, God allowed his people the idea of sacred space, but quite properly at the very end, he didn't need it. We're done with this. Before we move on to exile and Messiah, we're getting ready for Jesus. Critical to this discussion of sacred space was the lack of provision. This is a huge point. I hope you can see ahead where we're going. A lack of provision for the Gentile to be ritually cleansed if they remained Gentile. Rahab and Ruth proselytized, so they're still in our old story. What about the guy, Cornelius, who says, I like Yahweh, I worship Yahweh, but I ain't becoming a Jew? How do we work him into this story? Right now, at this point in our study, they are on the outside looking in. Let's move forward now into exile and Messiah to see how this can be solved.